And I just want to say that Jane and I are obviously pleased to be part of this and to talk about what we have called our four-voiced conversation with Flannery O'Connor, Simone Weil, and ourselves. This is what we put together in the book that Irene has mentioned, When Fiction and Philosophy Meet. That book grew from years of teaching and writing about each writer individually, separately, and then increasingly recognizing the resonances, or what we thought were resonances, between the two, despite the different genres in which each one worked. So we followed the tracks to a connection between the two, which we found largely in the correspondence, in O'Connor's correspondence. In a letter, some of this will be very familiar to many of you. In a letter to her friend Betty Hester in 1955, O'Connor asks if Hester has read anything by Simone Weil. O'Connor reports that she's only read a bit about her and refers to an article by Gerda Blumenthal titled The Cross of Dividedness, which appeared in the Third Hour. O'Connor quips that she thinks Weil's life is, quote, life is almost a perfect blending of the comic and the terrible, which two things may be opposite sides of the same coin. And she also said, you know, she's read a little about her, but she doesn't think she'd probably understand her, which isn't a very good beginning for a relationship, but nonetheless, it wasn't long afterwards that after these dismissive comments, that O'Connor asked Hester to send her books by Weil, which included, of course, Waiting for God. At Christmas then in 1956, just a year later, O'Connor received the notebooks of Simone Weil that had been at that time translated into English. Her response now had turned to admiration as she wrote to thank Hester for her gift, saying, Simone Weil is a mystery that should keep us all humble, and I need it more than most. Also, she's the example of the religious consciousness without a religion, which maybe sooner or later I will be able to write about, end quote.
So the notebooks and the essays in Waiting for God that Flannery O'Connor read were written after Simone Weil had had a mystical experience. Having been brought up as an agnostic in a family of thoroughly assimilated secular Jews in Paris, this unexpected closeness with the divine radically impacted her thinking. Her exceptional brilliance, recognized early on, had qualified her to receive the finest education France could offer. The study of philosophy with the goal of first understanding the underpinnings of human nature, and then communicating that knowledge through activism, teaching, and writing became her life's pursuit. Since philosophy engages basic principles of human reality, and Simone Weil's thinking had taken on a religious aura, Flannery O'Connor likely saw Weil's concepts as relevant to the message she was trying to convey through fiction. Ruthann and I have had the pleasure of discussing with colleagues and students the works of these gifted women writers in their individual search for truth. And having the opportunity, we decided to bring them into conversation, despite the vast differences in their heritage, language, education, and style. Their keen and unique insights into human nature often made Flannery and Simone feel alienated and even objects of mockery, but each knew that the message held within her had great value for their fellow human beings. Simone Weil often compared herself to the king's jester in either Velasquez's paintings or in Shakespeare's King Lear, where the fool, disparaged for an odd appearance, nevertheless dispenses valuable wisdom disdained by the more pretentious.
As an Irish Catholic in Protestant-dominated Georgia, Flannery O'Connor was an outsider of sorts herself. She lived amidst the legacies of the Civil War, the memory of which I think by the second decade of the 20th century seemed paradoxically, if superficially, both settled and unsettled. I say that because the facile memory was held together by a core master narrative of reunion, while Blacks and whites were sharply divided into separate societies. O'Connor was immersed in one part of those divided societies, witnessing and sometimes ambivalent about the entrenched racism of her own region, and concerned about the rapid spread of nihilism throughout the world. And of course, also from 1962 to 1965, Vatican II was taking place, major shifting events. Her keen observation and gift for satire, combined with an ironic eye, ear, and imagination, fueled, I think, her fascination with contradictions. These gifts made it not only possible for her to discern the subtler aspects of significant contradictions, such as social differences lived out on the Andalusia farm between landowners and sharecroppers, Blacks and whites, and religious fundamentalists of the South, and her own Catholic practices. Combined with her devotion to the Catholic faith, such contradictions became the means through which she expressed her responsibility as a fiction writer.
As an activist, Weil strove to motivate workers to seek better workplace conditions, not just salaries, but control in decision-making, enabling them to sharpen their ability to think, as well as giving them agency while making valuable contributions to society. Weil initiated workers' colleges to teach basic subjects, which included Greek and French literary classics that engage with universal human problems. After 3 major contacts with Christianity, a new understanding of the divine source of every person's existence is reflected in her notebooks and in the essays collected in Waiting for God. I think Flannery O'Connor would have sensed a kinship in Simone Weil's religious philosophy, which is ultimately centered on the teleological purpose of human life. Now, Weil's need to proclaim the word of a divine goal for every human life through her finely honed expository essays corresponds with the implicit religious convictions underpinning Flannery's unique narrative style. These 2 writers of quote unquote genius felt impelled to inform their readers of the eternal truth underlying the gift of life and to warn against the ever-present tendency toward idolatry. Idolatry of oneself, of one's possessions, or of a powerful leader. The question of responsibility of writers became acute for the French after the crushing fall of France in 1940, which led to the French nation being ruled by the iron hand of Nazi Germany. The French people appeared to have let slip through their hands the very liberty they had claimed to hold so dear. How could that ignominy have occurred? In Weil's mind, the failure of writers to delineate right from wrong, moral from immoral, good from evil, truth from lies, bore major responsibility for the transformation of the French democratic form of government into a fascist dictatorship. Weil claims that any country that does not nurture the truth but permits lies to be disseminated through its forms of communication is vulnerable to this same fate. Now, what would either Weil or O'Connor think of today's plethora of information flowing into vulnerable minds with no regard for verifiable truth.
Recognizing that Weil is a philosophical essayist and O'Connor a storyteller, the question comes up often, how did they apply those individual gifts as writers to the circumstances that they witnessed around them?
Well, for Weil, the implicit values held in the deep interior of our beings motivate our decisions, and good literature makes us reflect on those values, bringing them out into the open for careful consideration.
We're referring to values that create harmful illusions, such as imagining ourselves as the center of the universe, as the only persons who matter, that can be revealed through fiction, a result that O'Connor, I think, affects brilliantly.
Now, first-rate authors, without being moralists, can show that each decision leads to a good or a bad result. Consequently, a reader can experience virtually the results of disastrous choices without physically suffering the actual pain. Simone Weil's expository essays argue for the supreme virtue of giving attention to the other, enhancing cooperation and care, particularly for the vulnerable. Whereas Flannery O'Connor's approach, equally effective, portrays the negative effects of interactions that undermine relationships and increase pain and isolation. Now, to give creative, selfless attention to others, Weil developed a concept called decreation, a process of minimizing one's physical and psychological needs, which compose the personal element, the part that envelops the intangible soul. This egotistical part of every person that calls out for attention by persistently crying, me, 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 inhibits the ability to give as full attention to one's neighbor's needs as to one's own.
Flannery O'Connor's possessive landowners have their egos out in full display. They consider the hired help, Black and white, as these words come right from O'Connor, trashy, worthless, half-witted, stinking thieves, and imminently replaceable, thanks to the oppressive structures of the South. O'Connor's narratives depict relationships in which love of neighbor, as they talked about it, is usually or often absent.
For Weil, decreation doesn't mean destruction. It means returning the created part of one's being, the part that enables humans to exist in the world, into the uncreated state, which belongs to the divine order of the universe. Although this process might seem nihilistic, in Weil's religious philosophy, decreation has the positive effect of leading to a fuller participation in God's joyful act of creation. Fine literature, such as Flannery O'Connor's, can open our eyes to this truth of our condition. Weil's observation that fine art can be a catalyst for change of perspective toward the creator and toward one's fellow creature is relevant for every age. Weil and O'Connor agree that although art gets its substance from the life of human beings, the good that comes through art is a supernatural good and not the product of an individual human being. A goal of literary art is to show that the good is not the normal mode of events. Only through the agency of grace can a person do good with and for others, without regard to his or her own well-being. But one must be open to accepting the effect of grace with all the accompanying responsibilities. This reality can remain unacknowledged by the individual until art or harsh necessity in the form of violence brings it to the reader's consciousness.
As we all know, violence accompanies the offering of grace, it seems, in many O'Connor stories. But whether sufficient humility exists for it to be effective is often left ambiguous.
Good is abnormal in human affairs, which is why extreme suffering to the point of affliction exists in far too many places. But they believe that suffering itself can be part of the divine technique. In her notebooks, Weil muses on the mystery of all artists knowing that while a hierarchy of aesthetic values exists, some creative works are more beautiful than others, and that some things are beautiful and others are not. If they did not know this, they would not make the effort necessary to finish a work of art. They would not correct it. They would not continue perfecting their work. The responsibility of artists, obliged as they are to strive for an unknown beauty, brings a nuance of anguish to every effort of artistic creation. Neither Weil nor O'Connor were immune to that anguish, nor is any contemporary artist of genius free from the supreme effort engaged in creating a work of beauty that contains the truth and the good.
Based on what Jane has just described about Weil's thought, it probably is easy to detect similarities between Simone Weil's and Flannery O'Connor's views on art. O'Connor's, as you know, were informed by Jacques Maritain and Thomas Aquinas. For Maritain, the habit of art means a certain quality of virtue of the mind, said O'Connor. Art is, quote, writing something that is valuable in itself and that works in itself, and the basis of art is truth, both in matter and in mode. Or, as St. Thomas said, the artist is concerned with the good of that which is made. Both of those are from the nature and aim of fiction. To understand what I believe O'Connor saw as her responsibility or vocation as a writer, I suggest that we think about anagogy. Although O'Connor states clearly in her essays that anagogical vision is necessary for her readers, perhaps critics and scholars, students, haven't given sufficient attention to the ways O'Connor's superbly crafted stories are shaped by her reliance on her own anagogical imagination to fulfill her role as prophetic artist. In her essay, The Nature and the Aim of Fiction, Flannery O'Connor states that, quote, because the beginning of human knowledge is through the senses, the fiction writer begins where human perception begins, end quote. That is, of course, the concrete literal experiences taken in by sense perception. She continues and elaborates later in the same essay that, quote, the longer you look at an object, the more of the world you see in it. And it's well to remember that the serious fiction writer always writes about the whole world, no matter how limited his particular scene, end quote.
Simone Weil also starts with the material world. One must love the world here below as a reflection of divine love in order to return God's love.
O'Connor concludes that essay and those thoughts with the familiar instruction that her stories require, quote, the kind of mind that is willing to have its sense of mystery deepened by contact with reality and its sense of reality deepened by contact with mystery. But just what is that mystery?
Just cherishing the existence of authentic mystery was vital to Simone Weil's religious philosophy. A mystery nevertheless needs contemplation grounded on knowledge of the natural and supernatural world. A mystery reduced to a rational explanation is an absurdity.
in the ideas that I just highlighted and Jane also added to, O'Connor discloses two important facts about her writing. First, I think we can expect her to address the whole world, both natural and supernatural, through the concrete Georgia-inspired realities of her stories. Second, to speak about the whole world, or to make visible the invisible, she adapts a practice of scripture reading familiar in the Christian tradition. Just as a first level of scripture reading begins in the literal chronological sense, so O'Connor's stories are grounded in literal concrete detail through which she leads readers to contemplate and then to reimagine temporal existence in light of the supernatural revealed in the incarnation and throughout Hebrew and Christian scriptures. Paul M. Candler argues from O'Connor's own accounts in letters and essays and stories that she demonstrates what he calls, quote, the art of anagogical vision that sees all things as instances of participation in God, which, when read properly, are fragmentary disclosures of the divine glory, end quote.
Simone Weil had her own unique concept of reading, which she also considered as a disclosure of the divine. Her idea, however, applies particularly to human interaction. In each situation, especially among unequal participants, there should be an effort to discern a third reading, one that comes from God's perspective. A sincere reflection prior to action would include an attempt to imagine how God would interpret the situation according to the second most important commandment, to love one's neighbor.
Despite O'Connor's satire, irony, and engaging humor, O'Connor's vision and her art are basically sacramental. By that, I mean that she grounds her works, like biblical texts, in the scandals of the ordinary. And she regarded her vocation as a writer a sacred responsibility. She refused, I think, to see modern human beings as ahistorical, alienated, or as individual ends in themselves. She refused to accept a world of Manichaean, dualistic oppositions where nature and grace, reason and imagination, body and soul, stories and their meaning are separated from each other. Even good and evil are bound together, with evil arising from the denial or refusal of the good. She repeatedly affirmed and demonstrated that, quote, to see the world rightly is to see it anagogically, to see it in terms of the divine life and our participation in it, end quote. O'Connor shows us that, quote, reading anagogically is not just a function of biblical exegesis. It is a way of reading the entirety of creation as teleologically ordered to its consummation in its triune creator. That last quote is taken from Paul Candler's essay.
Simone Weil believed that the order of the world, established at its origins, is a form of God's implicit love for all creation, and that developing the quality of attention to the material world and to all humanity allows one to read the world in a divine sense.
O'Connor conveys her anagogical vision or imagination through symbols that I think do not have their significance assigned solely by her as an individual author for a single story. Rather, she tells us they have, quote, their essential place in the literary level, but they operate in depth as well as on the surface increasing the story in every direction, end quote. So we can trace the various devices through which she conveys these symbols that operate in every direction. For example, these are so common and familiar among she uses recurring natural images of the sun, the moon, the woods, ragged prophetic figures who perceive things from the margins or undersides of the visible. She also utilizes biblical typologies to link present time realities to ancient enduring types. In other words, she prefigures the characters or events of the Hebrew or Christian scriptures or from local or national history in 20th century garb and context, thereby linking what may seem like a self-contained, isolated story to the timeless human story.
Many of Flannery O'Connor's protagonists embody Simone Weil's concepts about timeless aspects of human nature, which is no surprise since both women, as I said, were on a search for truth. O'Connor's protagonists egotistically consider themselves as center of the universe, with no obligation to give serious attention to others' needs. They can dismiss the vulnerable at will, never questioning their own status as quote unquote good people. Their complicity in evil acts can produce a violent shock, even for them. Idolatry of their possessions or of the social structure is rampant. Of course, there's an implicit menace that any social transgressions could bring swift retribution. Both writers present the mysterious offer of grace to be accepted or refused. While Simone Weil exposes a world in which the decreation of self opens the ability to give the gift of attention, Flannery O'Connor, with the same purpose, describes the reverse, a society lacking these virtues, which we will see in Ruthann's following analysis of the displaced person.
I'm very grateful for Bruce Gentry's fine discussion of the displaced person in February, for it will be fresh, I think, in many minds, anyone who has heard him give that. And I also suspect that this story seems painfully relevant now, as we are witnessing vast displacements of people around in Europe. In The Displaced Person, O'Connor uses her anagogical imagination to depict the intertwining good and evil, through which I think she unmasks the idolatries, the vanities, the hubris of 20th and 21st century manifestations of narcissistic, nihilistic orientations to reality. And by so doing, she simultaneously invites her readers to develop their anagogical vision. Because O'Connor's descriptions of her characters are so vividly and entertainingly graphic, and the plot filled with fascinating ironic turns or inversions, it is easy to ignore or slide over the frequent allusions to biblical scenes or characters that fill the story, and which I think are central to understanding O'Connor's anagogical imagination. The story starts in the concrete of O'Connor's own farm, where there was once, as Bruce Gentry reminded us, in fact, a displaced family. Within the first 3 pages, while awaiting with the peacock the arrival of Mr. Gizak, O'Connor's narrator depicts the illusions and fears of Mrs. Shortley and Mrs. McIntyre, and the prejudices that keep Astor and Sulk hiding in the shadows to watch the arrival of the displaced person. The conflagrations in the war in Europe that bring him to the farm are mirrored, if hidden, right there and about to be disclosed. The title, of course, itself announces displacements caused by war and those that simultaneously existed in O'Connor's own region between whites and blacks and landowners and tenants. Displacement extends backwards in time, where it is a central theme of Hebrew and Christian scriptures, from the Exodus, displacement of the Israelites, to the displacement of the transcendent through the incarnation of God into human form as Jesus the Christ. The displacement that will be experienced on Mrs. McIntyre's farm, therefore, has theological and political implications of cosmic significance. Many, many readers conclude that Mr. Gizek functions as a Christ figure in the story without necessarily recognizing the anagogical lineage. I think Linda Monk in 1988 essay may be the first or one of the first to suggest that Mr. Gizek's name contains within it the root Isaac or Isaac from the Genesis story of averted sacrifice. Through anagogical vision, O'Connor makes Mr. Gizek an antitype of Isaac. Isaac was the long promised son of Abraham, as Jesus was the promised Messiah, son of God. Mr. Gizek is associated not merely through his name with an Old Testament type, Isaac, who is prefigured in Christ. He is bound through affliction as well. Mr. Gizek arrives on the McIntyre farm carrying his own suffering and displacement to confront the evil at the heart of the farm. O'Connor's knowledge of biblical events and characters, I think, is rather unusual. And that knowledge serves her anagogical imagination. But by using biblical typology, she not only exposes the evils on the McIntyre farm, she also links them to the human temptations for idolatry, disobedience, and evil throughout human history. By setting up a kind of dialectic between the biblical city of Tyre, where destruction was prophesied by Ezekiel, and the, quote, true country represented by Mr. Gizek, the priest, though I might argue he was pretty ineffectual, and the peacock, O'Connor's story increases in every direction. Attentive readers may note the similarity between the names of the ancient city destined for ruin and Mrs. McIntyre's. I believe Bruce Gentry called Mrs. Shortley the warm-up act in the story. We can't certainly miss her mounting anxiety about her own and Mr. Shortley's security on the farm, as Gizek, whom she considered a spy, welcomed by Mrs. McIntyre, performs miracles for Mrs. McIntyre. One afternoon, when Mrs. Shortley assumes responsibility to warn Esther and Salt what is going to happen to them, the narrator reports that she sits down on a block of salt. Seemingly an insignificant detail that I read over many, many times. At that moment in the story, it may, for the attentive reader, conjure up a vague allusion to Lot's wife, who turned into a block of salt by looking backwards. Anxiously, quote, Mrs. Shortley began to imagine a war of words, to see the Polish words and the English words coming at each other, stalking forward, not sentences, just words, gabble, 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 end quote, suggesting the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, which was an idolatrous construction that displeased God, explains the multiplicity of languages and the inability of human beings to understand one another. Mrs. Shortley is also convinced that the priest, quote, was leading foreigners over in hordes to places that were not theirs, to cause disputes, to uproot niggers, to plant the whore of Babylon in the midst of the righteous, end quote. She starts to pore over the apocalypse and to quote from the prophets. She has her Ezekiel-like vision, but ironically closes her eyes when she cannot tell whether the quote fiery wheels with those fierce dark eyes in them spinning rapidly all around were going forward or backward, end quote. when she does experience her final stroke, as she and her family leave the farm, the narrator reports that, quote, there was a peculiar lack of light in her icy blue eyes. All the vision in them might have been turned around backward, looking inside her. These eyes, like blue painted glass, seemed to contemplate for the first time the tremendous frontiers of her true country, end quote. Well, I've asserted that, there's evil at the heart of this farm. What are the evils at the heart of the farm? I think there is a fundamental confusion of values, which ties it in my mind very directly to Weil's ideas about the importance of values. The values that I think are most highly defended on the farm include Mrs. McIntyre's pretense, her pretense to maintain a reputation and appearances of righteousness that are detailed even in the late judge's office and his grave at the center of the farm. Another is deception, as illustrated by Chansey's secret still and the collusions around the final death of Guzac. Another would be duplicity, visible in Mrs. Shortley's shifting attitudes toward Astor and Salk and Mrs. McIntyre, and even in Mrs. McIntyre's and Mr. Shortley's relationship when he returns to the farm. And finally, I would link exploitation, suffering, and denial as another set of confusion about values. Those that are depicted through the servanthood, certainly of Guzac and the Negroes, which is almost incidentally suggested by the narrator's description at one point that, quote, bars of sunlight fell from the cracked ceiling across Astor's back and cut him in 3 distinct parts, end quote. Those words may recall Isaiah's words, but he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, and by his bruises we are healed, end quote. Mrs. McIntyre's conversations with Father Flynn about letting Mr. Guzac go after she discovers this terrible plot to bring Mr. Guzac's niece to marry one of her Negroes, those are reported in 3 parts on pages 317 to 320, if you ever want to look at it. In the first, she simply complains that he's extra. The second time, the narrator describes Father Flynn entranced with the cock and not paying attention to Mrs. McIntyre, as she says, I'm not responsible that Guzac has nowhere to go. And the priest suddenly exclaims, because he's looking at the clock, the transfiguration. The third denial occurs when, in exasperation, Mrs. McIntyre reports, Christ was just another DP. Resonances of Peter's denial of Christ when the cock crowed 3 times? I don't know. If we follow the biblical typologies present in the story, as Monk suggests, she encourages us to think about the judge's office as a perverted antitype of Solomon's temple. Why? Both Solomon and the judge were reputedly known for wisdom and wealth. But ironically, however, the narrator reports the judge's wisdom as cliches, and we all know he's bankrupt. The bank books, the ledgers, the locked, empty safe, as well as that naked granite cherub on his grave, all stand as testaments to idolatry. The decreation that Weil considered desirable and necessary in order to align oneself with the divine does not occur through choice or personal action in the displaced person. Rather, paranoid insecurity leads to Mrs. Shortley's end, and violence by premeditated collusion or inaction, imposes death on the body of Mr. Gisak. We can hardly call Mrs. McIntyre's end a choice to decreate in Vay's term. Rather, we witness the gradual external stripping away of the false values which leads to the collapse of her mind. Only the priest reciting doctrines of the church and feeding the peacock remains. The density of Flannery O'Connor's fiction derives, I think, from her masterful anagogical imagination to prefigure in 20th century conditions and garb biblical or historical events and characters that open even the religiously unbelieving toward some contemplation of mystery. The mystery at the center of O'Connor's sacramental fiction is that every aspect of creation, every moment of the ordinary, recognized or unacknowledged, whether in rebellion, denial, or praise, is infused with the presence of beauty, truth, and the holy.
So we can well imagine here that with this excellent analysis that Flannery O'Connor epitomizes Simone Weil's concept of a quote unquote first-rate writer who takes her responsibility to convey a consistent message of truth to her reader very seriously. Truly, they believe the life you save may be your own. A reflective reader can clearly discern good from evil, the moral from the immoral, in the relationships between the characters. The underlying values motivating their actions and the inevitable results become only too clear. O'Connor strives, as Ruthann has shown, to create beautiful narratives in form and in content with an underlying truth apparent to the close reader. The beauty of the cosmos plays an important role in her narratives, even in the lack of appreciation by its characters. Not only is there much to enjoy and to learn, as we have found, by bringing Simone Weil and Flannery O'Connor into a virtual conversation, but they also offer us valid criteria for judging the present clamorous discourse that surrounds us daily with little regard for communicating the truth. So at this point, we would really welcome your comments, your questions, your reflections in reaction to what we've had to say. And we're happy to hear whether you see their message as relevant of our times. That is the message of these two first-rate writers, Flannery O'Connor and Simone Weil.
Well, let me start because I get to start because it's my show. So first of all, thank you very much for this great talk. And I'm going to take part of Teresa Schuster in the comments asked a question about for you to unpack what anagogical vision means a little bit further. But I also want to say that in your book and in your discussion today, I keep thinking about Simone Weil's idea of attention. And both writers, in a way, say, pay attention to attention. And then as I was thinking about that, again, in my mixed up brain, I was thinking about Linda Lohman in Death of a Salesman. When Willie Lohman is dead, like a Christ figure in front of her, she says, attention must be paid. And I'm wondering what there is in the mid 20th century and now in the beginning of the 21st century that asks us to do that. That's a lot, but probably the anagogical one you can start with.
Yeah,
I start?
yeah, I will. I think the anagogical imagination is the capacity to see beyond the surface, to see in the literal, in the conditional or conditioned context, something of the unconditional. If you note and I'm sure you have, everybody has, in O'Connor's fiction, she relies heavily on the as if construction. It's peppered through her stories. In fact, she was told by Caroline Gordon to get rid of those because they're bothersome, but they're central to the anagogical vision. She is wanting to lead us from seeing things as they are to how they might be or they could be. And that's what I find really helpful in thinking about this story in particular, that she links these through this anagogical imagination to stories, biblical stories, or they could be historical stories. In other stories, she makes reference to events in history, so that we are asked to see again beneath the surfaces, to see the as moments as they either might have been or they still are being carried out in our own time. I don't know if that's helpful, but certainly for anagogical vision, you've got to pay attention. And attention is critical today. I'll let Jane say more about that. But I think that's also really, really central in reading O'Connor's fiction. And it's hard to pay attention because she's so wonderfully funny. And so you can just enjoy her and laugh with her. She loved it too, without recognizing that there's something else being pointed to or going on. Okay, Jane, go ahead.
It's a really good question or a comment there, Irene, because attention is the central kernel of all that Simone Weil has conceived in her religious philosophy. And it really isn't something all of a sudden new and discovered. It's something that's very apparent to us all. And attention means that not just an ordinary attention, but in her concept, it is truly emptying one's own ego, getting it out of the way, and giving full mind to the other person in all their needs. Now, this is extremely difficult to do. We all think we do pay attention, but actually, when you have a full attention where you've gotten your own self out of the way, you're able to give compassion. And I do think, and the basis of the word compassion means suffering with and passion. And in order to really have compassion for the other, you need to be able to just put yourselves in their place and then share some of their suffering. We all have wonderful examples of this, but they are kind of few and far between. And I do think that once again, we have this totally, I think, embodied in Mrs. McIntyre, because she really thinks that she's a good person. She's taking care of this farm. She took care of the judge. But when there is the possibility of bringing the sister from the camp, who's been in 3 different camps, even though, you know, Mrs. Shartley's talking about the boxcars and they all understand, just as we would from newsreels, etc., what's going on, she is unable to, constrained by her own inner lack of compassion, constrained by societal constraints, to do this one thing that could be, that's right presented to her to do this. Now, we're all presented with these possibilities every day, and if we really are, and it's very, and Simone Weil is the first to say this is extremely hard to actually look and spend time at the suffering of others, but it is vital to live the kind of society that would bring the best out for everyone. It truly is, in her mind, a model of love of one's neighbor. And I really think that Flannery O'Connor, in so many of her principal protagonists, she shows an absence of this ability to suffer with the other, to even understand the other, to listen to the other.
Thank you, Jane. I think we've got a couple more questions. I know, Heidi, you have a question. Why don't you start with your question?
Sure, and I don't claim to know Simone Weil very much, but I went to a talk that was done by one of my colleagues at my college, and she talked about Weil's idea of grace being water, and how water both carves and fills, is both a destructive force as well as an edifying force. And I've just been curious as to how that compares to O'Connor's view of grace, because obviously we all know that grace is a huge part of O'Connor's stories.
Well, it's a wonderful image. So thank you so much for that, because the grace is amorphous and it's intangible. So if I just speak in general terms, and not to go on with that image, which I like very much, grace is available to everyone. And I really think that, and of course, Flannery O'Connor makes it very evident that she believes in grace. And I do like, and this is very much the concept, it's available to everyone, but in both women's sense, but you need to consent to all the obligations that go along with it. So in the sense with the water, the amorphousness, it's not just one thing. It depends on the particular situation and how you're going to form the grace. And then you need to consent, but you need to consent with everything, that is, with accepting the suffering, with everything that the world presents us with. And so in a way, I would take a little note and say it's not so much the grace is destructive, unless we think that it is destroying the part of us that inhibits our giving full attention to the other. But it's a lovely image.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in Flannery O'Connor, I would see, certainly because the grace often comes in such violent ways, that it has that destructive power of water. If you're going to keep the water image, the force to which one can assent or refuse and be destroyed by, which is again paradoxical that grace has that much power. But I think I'm glad you brought up the image of the water. I think it's a very apt image.
And it's very provocative too, because in the sense of destruction, grace, in order to be fully accepted, and Simone Weil uses the image of a void, we have to have a place within us that we can imagine that grace would come in. Of course, grace is just this amorphous, intangible thing that we need to accept or not, that will give us courage to do what is needed to be done. But great, in order to make this space, which Simone Weil talks about a great deal, which is a void from our getting rid of ourselves, then you are sort of destroying something within yourself. But that is to make a void, to make a place where grace can enter in. So it's a great image. Thank you.
Well, Brian Newsom is on the phone. He can. Do you want to ask the question directly, Brian? Because you put the question into chat. Let's see if he's.
Sorry, I
Okay.
had a hard time getting from the chat back to the microphone. I was curious if Simone Weil had any connections with Catholic action organizations like the Jacques and the Jacques Feminine, the Young Christian Workers and its female branch, and if O'Connor ever forged any ties with comparable groups in the United States, and if so, in either case or both, what, if any, impact those connections might have had on their thoughts and their writings.
So I'll start in this case, Ruthann, with Simone Weil. Yes, surely when she was a young student. Now, remember, she was basically an agnostic, so she didn't at that time align herself with a religious or Christian group. But there were, especially between the two wars, there were several students. She was a pacifist, so many of the pacifist organizations she would participate in and give absolutely her most for that. Then, because the goal then, that was also in her secular humanist period, in which it wasn't an idea that you needed grace to do it. That was just sort of something she didn't really think about. But human beings can solve all the problems. And so she was very much in there helping whatever the group was, but she happened to be with one young Christian group. Then, of course, when she has had her mystical experiences, the Nazis roll into Paris, and she she's with her elderly parents, and they leave for Marseille, and she's down there, and she meets a Dominican priest called Joseph Marie Perrin, and he is a very quiet, reflective priest, but very active behind the scenes, both saving Jews, writing new passports, saving the refugees, and he has started at the behest of Saint Francis of Siena. He has started a means of living Christianity, incarnated Christianity throughout the world. So not throughout the world, yes, of course, but in your daily life. So she did participate in that too. Just have to mention, of course, both these women didn't live very long. Simone Weil died in 1943 at the age of 34. So she did a certain amount. She did an enormous amount for 34 years.
Yeah. And your question was also about whether Flannery O'Connor participated. Can you
Well, I was just curious if O'Connor ever established any ties with these Catholic youth organizations that sprang up in the United States, kind of inspired by their French and Belgian counterpart.
Not that I'm aware of, but if anybody else here in the group is, please speak up and tell us that.
Well, thank you for your insights. They're both, of course, fascinating, and as a scholar of French history, Weil has long been on the radar screen. Certainly,
yeah. One of the big challenges that we had in doing this together is recognizing that these people, of course, never met each other. And even if they had, I don't know that they would have how they would have gotten along. But there was an inordinate amount of respect on Flannery O'Connor's part, interestingly, for three Jewish women: Edith Stein, Simone Weil, and Hannah Arendt. I think that's just very, very significant. Even though O'Connor was much less a political activist than Simone Weil was, certainly in the early part of her life.
Well, John Dunaway, I think, supports that perhaps neither woman was incredibly easy, but that's the price you pay for being the type of women they are. But I think we're about ready to wrap up, but I think Craig Martell has a final question that he can share with us. Craig, you want to get back on?
Yeah, so well done, Ruthann and Jane. Much appreciate your insight. Just a question I had is, have you encountered anything where people have addressed Simone Weil's decreation to a similar notion that John of the Cross has, which is simply to get rid of yourself to make room for God?
Oh, there's a close connection, Craig. Yeah, glad you brought that up. She was a very devoted reader of John of the Cross, and many scholars have developed that because, of course, the thing about it is, and this is why we found with Flannery O'Connor and Simone Weil, you would never say, well, okay, one influenced the other, or it was because of one that the other wrote this way, but they're directed toward, as I've mentioned a couple of times, they're directed toward the truth of our existence, and then how do you live out that truth? And so some people can express it and have a sense of it even greater than others. So Simone Weil thought John of the Cross was absolutely a spectacular example of perfection in living, and a number of scholars have developed that, looking carefully at the writings.
Thank you.
And I think now is the time to thank our wonderful presenters, Ruthann and Jane. It was just a wonderful evening. Everybody's cats and dogs were just exemplary. We enjoyed them very much. And this will be recorded, and we will have it up on our website and up on our Facebook page. See you all soon. Take
Thank
care.
Thank you to everyone for coming.
Bye-bye.